What's up, guys? Thanks for watching. Would appreciate a like, subscribe, comment down below. Would love to see you engage, and thanks for watching. On April 6, 2022, Tucker Carlson took aim at someone no one had ever heard of on his then evening Fox News show. Carlson, at that point becoming so radioactive to the quote-unquote conservative news world, kept taking shots at who he viewed the most sinful to Donald Trump's MAGA movement and coalition: establishment Republican politicians. He wrote a book with lampoonish drawings of Lindsey Graham, Bill Kristol, and Mitch McConnell on them. He regularly rebuked them on his nightly show. He called them impotent and selfish oafs, which of course they were. This type of behavior was dangerous for someone like Tucker Carlson, of whom himself was just as swampy as the rest of the swamp creatures he regularly targeted, at least on paper. It was the same type of behavior that would get him later fired from Fox News a little more than a year later. But it was then, and still is today, the right behavior to take. Conservatives, as we've talked about several times on this show, and we will continue to talk about on this show, are supposedly the part of values, the traditionalists, the people that want to see things like faith, family, and freedom championed, at least in theory. But to put it mildly, our quote-unquote conservative leadership class, particularly of yesteryear, is not that at all. In fact, they aren't conservative at all. They were the same mild, half-baked liberals as those on the, quote, other side of the aisle. They went to the same dinner parties. They attended the same alumni gatherings. They licked the right boots of their corporate donor class. Their summer homes in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard were right down the street from one another. They were, quite literally, almost no different between them at all, from policy preferences to vacation destinations. Tucker Carlson was the only one in corporate media, and big-time corporate media, to point out this inconvenient fact. He was regularly scorned by it by fellow hosts Sean Hannity, Brian Kilmeade, and Mark Levin, even though they themselves, of course, never had the guts to bring it up to him personally. This is because, of course, they live the same lifestyle as the politicians they covered. For all the talks of quote-unquote collusion that's dominated the airwaves over the last 5 years from Russia to Israel, that type of collusion has still, to this day, never been pointed out. However, in this monologue, one that would be heralded among his best, he did not take aim at Graham, Kristol, or McConnell. Instead, he took aim at the then and current governor of Utah, Spencer Cox. Cox, of the same milquetoast breed of quote-unquote conservative politician as all of the aforementioned people, was not who he said he was. He was described by Carlson as a, quote, cut-rate Gavin Newsom imitator and a, quote, low IQ weekend MSNBC anchor. This is harsh criticism. Carlson himself was blasted for it. How dare you attack one of your own? The radical left is destroying this country. Talk about how dumb Joe Biden is. Rah! Those are the easy talking points. Those are the talking points that the boomers and the think tank executives who watch Fox News did so for. But they were also the easy conversations to have, the obvious conversations to have. Everyone knew that political unity was advantageous, that the leftist plague in our society was terminal, and that Joe Biden was a buffoon. There was no meaningful ground to be gained there. It was Carlson's job, therefore, to have the tough conversations, the necessary conversations. One of these conversations that so desperately needed to be had, but what wasn't being had at all, was one about conservatives, leaders, politicians, and men like Spencer Cox. Cox, like most mainline conservatives over the last 40 years, had, quote, fallen right off into the ledge and into the deep end of vacuous lifestyle liberalism, said Carlson. Again, a bold claim to make, for sure. But the real question, the question no one on the so-called, quote, right asked, was the only question that mattered. Was it true? Carlson had plenty of data to back his claim. The biggest one was when Cox was giving a virtual town hall to a group of so-called LGBTQ high school students. This is an oxymoronic claim, obviously. These are children. They may feel things and are discovering some things about their expression and identity. But to make a claim about life-altering sexual identity and orientation at 14? A bit of a stretch, said any sane person up until approximately 45 minutes ago. But not to Spencer Cox. When a female student asked him a question with her, quote, she, her, hers pronouns attached, Cox had the following response, quote, my preferred pronouns are he, him, his, so thank you for sharing yours, end quote. It should be noted again, obviously, that this is absolutely insane. Utah is one of the most reliably conservative states in the country. It's a beacon of religious liberty. It holds by far the most Mormons than any other state in the union, for example. They voted for Donald Trump at about above a 60% rate. They have bigger family sizes. Their marriage rates are a lot better and happen a lot earlier and are a lot healthier. You would think that Spencer Cox, as a supposedly conservative person, would at least make a veiled attempt to reflect conservative values. But you'd be wrong. Instead, he chose to affirm a confused child's gender's pronouns by saying his own pronouns in front of her in a room in front of other confused children. Little did Spencer Cox recall, but he was violating his own rule because earlier in his career, after a horrific shooting at a gay nightclub, Cox commented that, quote, "I was the last person they wanted to hear from, a straight, white, Mormon, middle-aged Republican," end quote. Got it? It's not enough to state your gender pronouns as a quote-unquote conservative politician in the state of Utah. Now you have to disavow your race, religion, age, and political orientation as well. If the inverse of any of this were pulled, of course, Cox would be affirmed as a quote, brave and, quote, a hero. But in both cases, this is wrong. It is not at all brave or heroic to publicly flog yourself for who you are. It's a symbol of your own humiliation and self-loathing. As Carlson put it in his monologue, Cox was now in the running to become, quote, America's guiltiest white guy. A tough task to win, especially in 2022, mind you. But that didn't stop him from trying. Because Cox backed this up with legislation as well. When other politicians such as Ron DeSantis were talking about the banning of critical race theory, a horrifying Marxist concept in schools, Cox was justifying it. He was working, quote unquote, across the aisle to install a, quote unquote, new curriculum with that same Marxist concept. In addition, he signed the so-called Utah Compact on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It called the current racist structure in the United States a, quote, system that can only be stopped with bold anti-racist actions and policies, end quote. Strangely enough, Cox didn't think it was racist to exclude white children from opportunities for scholarships and asked about it on a Zoom call, where he also was wearing a COVID obedience mask with a Utahian mountain range on it for some reason. But we all know the reason why, obviously. Not having quite enough of the LGBTQ agenda, Cox vetoed a piece of legislation called House Bill 11 that banned men from competing in women's sports within the state of Utah, as well as a bill that would have banned transgender surgeries for minors. Not only was Cox betraying his voters, but his own colleagues in state Congress. He must have just put in an order for a new desk plate with his pronouns attached. It's the only logical explanation. Perhaps the most revealing thing about Spencer Cox came from an article from Time magazine entitled, quote, Spencer Cox, the red state governor, not afraid to be, quote, woke. In it, the reporter asked, why rock the boat? Why step right into America's hottest culture war with no apparent political benefit? No apparent political benefit? Really? Again, the state of Utah has some of the most conservative-leaning people in the country. You don't even have to be conservative to not want to chop the body parts off of mentally confused children and not have your son dunk on your neighbor's daughter in a game of JV women's high school basketball. You just have to be a person with a functioning brain. Cox's answer to that question said it all. Quote, this idea that you're a coward for being kind, it's so anti-Christian, it's so anti-American, and I mean that, end quote. Anti-Christian to not chop off children's healthy body parts? Kindness is allowing women to break their faces on volleyballs spiked into them by men? Anti-American, like treasonous, the only crime directly spelled out in the United States Constitution that's punishable by death? On and on it went. Cox recycled the same garbage milquetoast right-wing talking points. He was a quote-unquote compassionate conservative. He wanted, quote, unity. He hit just about every buzzword you can imagine. Quote, deaths of despair, the quote, happiness gap, the quote, empathy crisis, the quote, trust barometer. He tried to appear trendy to people that hated his conservative constituents, saying that he reads The Atlantic magazine and admires the works of people like Thomas Friedman and Ezra Klein. He's more educated than you, obviously, smarter than you, and better as well. He was once an executive at a telecommunications company. Were you an executive at a telecommunications company? No? Shut up, you rube. Ask yourself, do these actions reflect the desires of the average Utah resident? Of course not. Spencer Cox is not at all a conservative, even though he claims to be. In that way, he's shameful. He doesn't stand up for the people that elect him. He slaps a label onto himself, cosplays as something he clearly isn't, and backstabs all of them on the way to the governor's house. He's in a red state, after all. He knows no one would dare to challenge him. This conservative apathy is a ticking time bomb that we need to get ahead of. It is slowly eating alive red states and conservative movements across the country, hollowing them from within. Conservatism and traditional values have not been set back because America has gone less conservative and traditional. In fact, it has done the exact opposite. There's data to prove it. Instead, the reason why values have gone by the decline is that conservative leadership has gone completely soft. It is the same in our policies as it is in our churches, our businesses, and our families. Most children in America grow up in a home predominantly with one parent. Pastors and priests preach a social gospel instead of the actual gospel, the eternity-altering words of Jesus Christ. Businesses don't have any values outside of their share price. Anything else, any ethical compass at all, is cut out for that idolatry of the almighty share price. Our problem in this country is plain and simple: weak leaders in positions of leadership. Like men like Spencer Cox, men like James Lankford, John Cornyn, Mitch McConnell, Dan Crenshaw, Bill Cassidy, Joni Ernst, and so many others. Men who claim to be quote-unquote conservative, quote Christian or otherwise, and are counted on by their voters to be, but instead actually govern as they actually are, as who they actually are. Lifestyle liberals who ride the coattails of conservatism, while the people they've put into positions of responsibility to care for descend into hell. Which leads me to Charlie Kirk. 2 weeks ago, Charlie Kirk was assassinated in front of 3,000 students at Utah Valley University, the largest university in the state. A large accomplishment, consider that Brigham Young University, or BYU, and the University of Utah are far both bigger brands. To be abundantly clear, it was not Spencer Cox's fault that Charlie Kirk was murdered, that 3,000 students are traumatized for life, and that Charlie Kirk's family is left without a husband and a father. Spencer Cox, to his credit, sprung into action immediately. He immediately declared Kirk's assassination a terrorist threat and a political assassination. He condemned anyone who would celebrate something as demonic and evil as we saw 2 Wednesdays ago. He moved heaven and earth to find Tyler Robinson, the man who shot Charlie Kirk. On these measures, he should be commended, as he has already been. On the other hand, however, we must also address something. Charlie Kirk, as mentioned multiple times on this show and throughout the media rightly, was not a mean person. All outlets shamefully portraying him as such are wrong. Charlie Kirk was a very nice person. It's not necessarily the attacks on Charlie's character are baseless and dehumanizing, which of course they are, but it's just that they're incorrect. Charlie was a good person and took it to his heart that he acted as one as often as he could. His faith commanded him to, so he was. That said, there was no more fervent opposition force to people like Spencer Cox than Charlie Kirk. He tweeted multiple times correctly about how Cox must be immediately primaried and taken out of office. It wasn't that Charlie Kirk had something against Spencer Cox, because he didn't. He wasn't vindictive. It was that Charlie was something that Spencer Cox could never have been. A leader, a warrior for conservative Christian causes that most defined the MAGA movement. Charlie Kirk was also the most loyal person to the head of the MAGA movement, Donald Trump, up until the day of his death. Anyone who crossed that Rubicon crossed Charlie Kirk, which you really didn't want to do. And now here we are. Charlie Kirk is dead by an assassin's bullet. The conservative movement is left without its defining political talent among young people, one of the great political organizers of all time, and potentially the greatest non-corporate evangelist of this era. There are an innumerable number of tragic things that we can say about the murder and assassination of Charlie Kirk. Yet as the dust is settling, conservatives are finally beginning to wake up to some of the things that are needing to be done, things that people like Charlie Kirk have been advocating for a very long time. One of those things, the thing I would argue we must do first, is that we must purge our leadership class of people like Spencer Cox, weak, spineless, impotent, useless people who do nothing but take up space so that people wired like Charlie Kirk can't rock the boat too much. This is not a time of quote-unquote compassionate conservatism and quote unity anymore. That was already over a long time ago. The bullet that Charlie Kirk took in the neck just made it abundantly clear, which is an indictment on all of us. Therefore, one of the best things we can do in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder is the following: the identification and removal of all cowardly, limp-dicked, and weak-kneed leaders in our movement as soon as humanly possible. We will not use force. We will not use violence. We will not use call to arms. As it has been made clear, those are tools of the left. Charlie would have hated it if we would have adopted them for ourselves. But, as proved by Charlie Kirk's assassination, as well as the murder of Irina Zarutska on a Charlotte subway and school children in Minneapolis, we are in a time of open war against value-oriented people, particularly Christian people of all stripes. Most of these events, shamefully, have happened under the guise of conservative leaders. This is an indictment on our leadership class, particularly our male leadership class. One of the best questions I've heard asked in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder was the following: why on earth was Charlie doing so much? A very big part of it is simple: because he wanted to. That's just who Charlie was. He was a worker. He was a grinder. He wanted to be productive, to be useful, and to inspire others to do so as well, to fulfill the command that God gave Adam in the garden, to work. But yet there's a more uncomfortable angle to this as well, what we're going to be dedicating this entire show to today. No one else had the guts to step up and do it. In particular, no other men had the guts to step up and do it. Charlie Kirk did so much for just being one person. But the most insightful part of Charlie's message, one that has hit home for me over the past 2 weeks, is that he knew he couldn't do it as one person. A huge part of Charlie's message was to get others, particularly other men, to step up to create a multiplier effect of Charlie Kirk's. More men stepping up to lead in church ministries, start families, open up companies, and raise children. And again, to his amazing credit, this has taken hold with young people. The youth vote delivered in the election for Donald Trump in November of 2024. It made them the most Christian and conservative generation on record, reversing a century of decline in both of those areas. They want to run for office. They want to start families. They want to get married. They want to go to church. They want to be entrepreneurial. But sadly, there are still men like Spencer Cox and other men of Gen X that are throwing cold water onto the fire that people like Charlie Kirk had awakened in Gen Z. They were too cool for school for people like Charlie Kirk. They viewed him as an annoyance rather than an asset. They would have much preferred if he simply went away, shut up, and never came back. The same is true with all people he inspired, by the way. And what have they done with that responsibility? Simply manage the slow but steady and sure decline of America to become a demoralized, dejected, and weak culture, run by a demoralized, dejected, and weak leadership class. Turning America into a failed state by turning their eyes from the problems that needed to be fixed and by sending our young people into a nihilistic and suicidal, quite literally, death spiral. This is unacceptable. On my watch, and I believe on the watch of my entire generation, it will not continue. Now is not the time for weak-willed statements on social media or, quote, tough conversations with, quote, friends. No. Now is the time for brass knuckles. Now is the time for purging weakness from our cause and weak people along with it. No more pronouns. No more anti-racism. No more appeasement or apology for your skin color or your political beliefs or your religious faith. No more retreat. We advance. We play offense all the time. Not one single step back. Ever.